I have with me a panel of strategists. Joining me on the Political Pulse, I have with me David Zimmer for the Liberals, Marisa CTV for the Conservatives, and Cam Holstrom for the NDP. Good evening to all of you and welcome to the Political Pulse.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Yeah. All right, let's make a start with you, David. What has stood out for you the most in the campaign so far where the Liberals are concerned? And how do you think that will benefit Justin Trudeau in comparison to his opponents?
Well, I think this first week of the campaign is all the political parties are struggling for trying to define what the ballot question is going to be. That's key to any election. And so far, I don't think there's been any clear ballot question that has emerged other than this. And this could be very dangerous for the Liberals. If the ballot question becomes, was this election necessary, that does not augur well for the Liberals. The other issues that you've talked about, housing and various other types of social relief and so on, all the parties have been saying that and preaching that over the months. But in voters' minds, I don't think that has jumped forward to delineate itself as a ballot question. I worry that in people's minds, the ballot question becomes, was the election necessary? That may be why the polls have closed between the Tories and the Liberals this last couple of days. That ballot question, is the election necessary, does not augur well for the Liberals.
That's a very good point, and I'll come to more details about what we are seeing on the ground where the provincial map is also concerned and about if people are ready or not for elections. Marisa, but let me start with you on the Nanos poll. Now, Conservatives are fast catching up with the Liberals and the margins are narrowing. What do you think is working for the Conservatives here? Marisa.
Yeah, I think the Conservatives have been very disciplined on messaging throughout the first week of the campaign, even after some pretty desperate attempts from the Liberals to switch the channel to some divisive issues. They've been focusing on issues that speak to their existing Conservative support and accessible likely swing voters for them by talking about the issues that they're bringing up at the doors, like job security post-pandemic, housing affordability, mental health, lowering the cost of living. The benefit of O'Toole launching his platform so early in the campaign is that his campaign will be driving the agenda and the conversation, and that's why I think we're seeing some very positive developments in the polls, because he's been driving the conversations about the issues that matter most.
Okay, Cam, let me bring you in. The NDP last time, as we know, lost seats under Jagmeet Singh, but the minority government worked well for the NDP. Singh was able to push a lot of NDP agenda on several fronts like we saw during the course of the pandemic. With experience on his side and the promises of, affordable housing, pharmacare, childcare, what do you think Singh needs to do more to increase his vote share? Because if you look at the latest polls, Cam, there is a wide gap between the new Conservative leader, Erin O'Toole, and the experienced Jagmeet Singh.
And you know what? You're right, but you know what? There's still a month left in this campaign. We saw it in 2015. We saw it in 2011, how things quickly can change over the span of a couple of weeks. I think it's a real bad sign for the Liberals that things started moving already. That tells me that there is some uneasiness with the back of this campaign. And let's be honest, this minority parliament was working, legislation was getting passed, people were getting help. And it does ask the question, why was this campaign necessary? Marisa mentioned the platform released by Conservatives. The NDP released theirs the week before. The party that said we had to have this election, have a serious conversation about our future, is the one who hasn't released their platform yet, and they don't seem to be ready to. All their announcements this week were things that they were in their budget that they could have gotten done through the House. For example, the sick days that they announced yesterday in Winnipeg. The NDP has been pushing back for 18 months. If they went back to the House tomorrow and did it, it would be done. We didn't need the election to make this happen. And I think that is where the NDP really has some advantage here, is that, look, they've been showing they're willing to work, put the partisanship aside, and do what's needed.
Right.
Whereas I think people are looking at this Prime Minister right now and asking, what is this all about? There was an Ipsos poll that came out yesterday that showed that 44% of Canadians think that Justin Trudeau really can't be trusted, that he's only looking out for himself, and that 36% feel he will say anything to get elected. That's not a good place to be in if you're trying to fight against somebody who's as genuine as Jagmeet Singh.
David, how would you like to respond to what Cam is saying? And I want to reiterate the point about the 10-day paid sick leave, because that is something, as we very clearly know, provinces were asking for it, opposition was asking for it. If Justin Trudeau wanted it, he could have done it 10 months ago, but he didn't.
Well, the issue here is how quickly can the government of the day bring itself to a point of decision? And all governments find it difficult to make decisions on all these issues that we've been talking about, because they're always keeping an eye on what the other party is going to say. Their decision on it has got to somehow up the other party's response and so on. So we're playing this sort of, the political parties, in my view, are playing this sort of inside baseball game. Who can sound the best on the housing issue? Who can sound the best on the immigration issue? But people have heard about all of those issues from all of the parties, and it doesn't really clearly resonate with them, other than to say, well, they're sort of basically all saying the same thing. They'll do a better job than the other party. But that's not enough to create a ballot question. A ballot question has got to be something that jumps out of the pack. Either the Tories define the ballot question, or the NDP, or the Liberals. And the ballot question has to be defined in such a way that it's to the advantage of the party defining the ballot question. I know I've talked about this in my opening comments.
Right.
But I am really worried that the ballot question becomes, was this election necessary?
Yeah. Yeah, many people are actually beginning to question that already, because as we know, Parliament was working. The leader may say that it was toxic, the environment was not working, but the fact is, we saw that how much of paperwork actually happened in the Parliament. Okay, I'm going to request you all to stay with us, because it's time now for us to discuss the other topic on political pulse. The other development, political development, is the surprise Tory surge that upset the majority Liberal government in Nova Scotia with a campaign focused on health. Marisa, I want to bring you in on this one. Now Conservatives have another province on the Canadian map. Let's take a look at that map once again we have for our viewers. You will see this huge stretch of blue. Most of these provinces across the country are right now governed by the Conservatives. We have, of course, BC with the NDP and parts of Atlantic Canada with the Liberals. Is this reflective, Marisa, of the mood on a national front?
Look, I think this is a great opportunity for the Conservatives fairly. It'll allow them to talk about the big issues out east, out in Nova Scotia, like healthcare, health transfers, something that the federal Conservatives have already been looking at in their platform by means of increasing health transfers up to 6%. So look, if I were the federal Liberals, I would have been banking on that safe Nova Scotia win as a sign of momentum for the province and for the region. It's clear that the voters in Nova Scotia rejected the political opportunism that came with that election, and I'm sure the Conservatives are watching that very closely. And from an electoral perspective, this is the first time an incumbent government lost an election. So they called it at a time where voters clearly didn't see the need for one. So I think the Conservatives federally are watching that. This is an open gate for the federal Conservatives.
Right.
And the next couple of weeks time will tell on that one.
Time will tell on that one. Cam, the fact is, we understand that issues usually are very different when it comes to provincial issues versus federal issues. But here we are at a time when this was the first time around that an incumbent was not able to come back to power, especially in the pandemic. We've seen other provinces go through elections and governments have come back with majority. How is the NDP watching this, Cam? I mean, 6 seats in the House Assembly now. If there was a lesson to be drawn from Premier Houston's campaign, what would it be, Cam?
Well, it's also the same lesson that Gary Burrow's campaign had in Nova Scotia. There was that focus on issues that people cared about. Mr. Houston talked about healthcare. Mr. Burrow talked a lot about rent control, and that really connected, especially in the metro area around Halifax. But I think the big lesson that parties can take away from what happened in this campaign is that that people are unsettled. People don't have the patience for the usual political verbiage, lingo, whatever. They don't have the patience to put up when they're being toyed with. And that's what happened with this campaign. They went early as well. Basically, it was almost a mirror image of what Mr. Trudeau is trying to do now. The only thing I would note, though, is that for the Conservatives, the lesson here is that you can win Nova Scotia if you don't run like Aaron O'Toole, because Tim Houston went far out of his way to distance himself from Mr. O'Toole, saying they are not in the same party. He threw him under the bus and backed over him a couple times before he got to that majority. So I think there's some lessons there for the Conservatives maybe in the long run about how they could form a national government, but I don't know how much that helps them in this moment today.
Okay, interesting points of analogy there. Okay, but David, I want to bring you in. I mean, a lot of people are wondering, David, what happened to the Liberals in Nova Scotia? How come the Liberals didn't see this coming and their calculation went so wrong?
Well, the government there had been in power for 15 years. So number one, all governments age. 15 years is a long, long run. You know, the Liberals had a 15-year run in Ontario and they got clipped by Mike Harris. They just got stale. The other thing I think that is affecting people is people are, they're uncertain now, they're cranky, they're edgy. It's a hot, stinking summer. We've got all these climate change problems. We've got the COVID problems. We've got the Delta variant problems. We've got problems on the international scene with Afghanistan and what the Americans are going to do there and what Canada should be doing. And there's a whole lot of uncertainty and edginess. And when people feel like that, in my experience, they tend to punish governments. I think that's what's happened in Nova Scotia. Interesting enough, you go back 30 years ago.
David, sorry for interrupting. I understand what you're saying, but you don't think this has got to do with the mood and calling of the election right now and how people do not maybe want an election? Because several polls indicate that Canadians are not comfortable with the idea of going for a full-fledged election. You don't think it reflects any of that, David?
Yeah, no, of course it does. And those are I made that point twice in my earlier comments. I say when you've got all these other issues that are making people edgy and nervous and unsettled, COVID, right, all of these sorts of things, and then you throw that on top of that a sense that why are we having an election when we should be down in the trenches doing the nitty-gritty of dealing with COVID and housing and climate change and so on. That just compounds this idea in people's minds that why are we having an election? We should be out there just working on a day-to-day basis, right, to tackle these problems in detail.
Okay, we'll have to leave it at that on today's note, but of course a lot more to discuss where the campaign trail is concerned. For today, David Zimmer, Marisa CTV, and Cam Holstrom, thank you for joining me on the Political Pulse. Appreciate it.
Thank you
so much.
And with that, let's shift our focus to the other news we are tracking closely, the situation in Afghanistan. A second Canadian flight has now left Kabul, evacuating 106 more Afghans from the chaotic